Greetings anyone, and welcome to the first video on this new channel of mine, called B Looks at Random Games, or BLAR Games for short. B is me, and on this channel I'll be looking at some, well, random games. I guess that's pretty obvious. But what may be less obvious, and what you might be asking yourself is, what kind of videos will there be on this channel? And while I'd love to answer that question, unfortunately I really can't at the moment. I simply don't yet know what kind of videos I'll be making in the future, though I do have a few ideas. For now, my focus is totally on making this 4-part series on the year 1998, of which this is the first episode. It'll probably take me at least the rest of this year to finish it, and hopefully not much longer. But what comes next is still a total mystery, even to me. So for the next few minutes, I'm gonna go into my concept for this video essay or thesis, or whatever, and clarify what I mean by the fairly bold statement of why 1998 is probably the greatest year in gaming. So if you don't care about any of that, and just want to go straight to the game's discussion, then feel free to skip past the intro to this time right here. Still here? Cool. Then let's mosey. A few years ago, as a steady stream of masterpieces kept arriving throughout 2017, lots of critics and others within games media started to wonder if it just might be one of the all-time best years for video games. As 2017 came to a close, it left behind it a truly stellar lineup of titles, including new entries in 2 of Nintendo's most popular franchises, with Super Mario Odyssey and Zelda Breath of the Wild, which many argued were the best in their respective series, and gave the Nintendo Switch a flying start. Other platforms also had some big exclusives of their own, and all in all it was simply a glut of great games coming out for every system. From the biggest of big AAA open worlds to indie titles made by first-time developers. GameSpot, a site which had always been sparing with their 10 out of 10 scores, granting only 19 games that honor since 1996, gave out 3 10s in 2017 alone. So I found myself becoming persuaded by the argument, especially after playing many of the games for myself. The case for 2017 seemed very strong, and there were few other years I could think of with so many big hitters one after the other. But it also made me wonder, what truly is the greatest year for games ever? And how would you even go about finding the answer? There's many ways to define quote-unquote best or greatest when it comes to ranking a year by its games, and they're always going to be somewhat subjective. Perhaps the most unbiased metric, or the one closest to objectivity, is just to look at the quality of its games by way of critical ratings and popularity. And love it or hate it, Metacritic and other rating aggregators are probably the best measure of that. So let's say you use Metacritic as your quality metric. Do you judge a year by looking at literally all of its games? Calculating the average score of the hundreds or even thousands released in a 12-month period? I don't think so. In any case, nobody remembers a year for its worst games, or its run-of-the-mill games. An eagerly anticipated release that turns into a disappointment might linger in the memory and tarnish a good year's reputation. But in general, we remember a year for the cream of its crop. Which begs the question, how much of that, cream do you taste? Do you have to look at 50 or 100 games to be statistically relevant? Or can you judge a year by only its 5 or 10 best games? I don't think there's any specific cutoff point that gives you the definitive worth of a year, but in my personal view, looking at around 20 of the most highly rated titles should paint a pretty good picture. If games near the bottom of that list, in 19th and 20th place, are still getting scores anywhere near 90%, then you know you're looking at a truly outstanding 12-month period. Many years lack even 10 titles in that range, and in some cases critics have awarded Game of the Year to a game which barely reached the high 80s. So basically, that's been the rule of thumb I tried to follow making this video. To find about 20 of the greatest video games from 1998, based on their critical and commercial reception, and use them as evidence for my case. But my plan wasn't just to find the 20 best games, however you define that, and leave it there. Quality is only one of 3 criteria I looked at, and since standards have changed dramatically in the last 2 decades, maybe not the most important one. My second criteria is more vague, and perhaps the most difficult one to judge. How iconic is a game? To be iconic is one of those immutable properties which I don't think can really be measured or quantified. It's more of an either-or thing. Either a game, or movie, album, etc. is iconic, or it isn't. It's also not something which can be judged right off the bat, no matter how popular a game is at release, but gradually becomes apparent over time, as a game's lasting reputation becomes established. Even then, it may change with time, as games from a certain era will be iconic for that generation of players, whereas much younger gamers may not even know about it. So it's a pretty fluid criterion which is tricky to pin down. As such, I won't try to judge whether each game deserves to be called iconic, but I have tried to fill this list mainly with games that seem to fit the bill, and in rare cases I might include a unique game which feels more iconic in some way over another which is technically rated higher by critics or fans, as a higher rated game isn't always the more interesting one. My third criteria, however, and the only one I do intend to judge, is influence. To me, it's the most important and interesting of the three, and it lies at the core of my concept for this video. In a nutshell, my main goal is to try and uncover just how influential the great games of 1998 really were, as the debate over their quality or iconic status has more or less been settled by now. So how do I intend to do that? Well, it's obviously not an exact science, far from it, but I do still believe that the question of a game's influence is one which has a definite answer. Unlike the issue of how iconic a game is, its influence isn't just based on people's opinions or a general consensus, but something more concrete, something which really exists out there in the ether and could in principle be discovered. The problems start with discovering it in practice, because how are you ever actually going to find out the true extent of the influence of anything? To do that requires gathering a frankly ridiculous amount of information, some of which is inaccessible anyway, since it often exists only within the minds of those who were possibly influenced. Of course, now and then a developer will just come straight out and acknowledge their inspirations directly. But that usually doesn't happen. Well, usually. As an example, take Final Fantasy VII, one of the most famous and undoubtedly most influential Japanese RPGs of all time. I'm willing to bet a fair amount of my savings that at least 70 or even 80% of developers working on a JRPG after 1997 had played it, and probably had it at the back of their minds consciously or subconsciously at some point as they worked on their own games. If they thought about it subconsciously, does that mean it influenced their work? Well, I have no idea, because if they don't know about it, then how could I? But what about consciously? Then yeah, it probably did, even if only in a minor way, but unless they talk about it publicly, or the similarities are plain to see, then it's hard to know for sure. In that sense, there can always be an ambient level of influence from any game that can be very hard to uncover. I only mention this to make the broader point that it's next to impossible to know the true extent of a thing's influence, not just for games, but any other influential piece of media, art, or anything else. Still, I do think there are some aspects of influence that can be discovered, some of them very obvious, and others less so. Games can be influential in a wide variety of possible ways, beyond the subconscious or ambient ways you can never be fully certain of. Those ways include how a single, iconic, or very successful game influenced the choices its developer or company makes after it, perhaps through multiple sequels, or by shipping certain design philosophies. Or how a new innovation becomes a common trend throughout a game's genre, or changes something fundamentally for future games. In rare cases, a very original or unique game can even plant the seed for a whole new genre, either by doing something first, or by doing it better than those who came before. So all those mechanisms of influence and more will come into play as I try to decipher the impact of the games on this list. Beyond that, there's also the matter of career-defining games for the developers who make them. This may be more of a fuzzy area, but I believe that certain games can play such an important role in the future work of game designers or studios that their influence on them at least seems undeniable, though again, it's hard to know for sure unless they say so themselves. It can also lead to a kind of chicken and egg scenario, as in, can a game really influence its developer if it was made by that developer? Isn't it the other way around, that the game is influenced by those making it? Well, yes and no, or maybe. Like I said, it's fuzzy, but very few games are made totally by one person, so the input of multiple devs may have an effect on whoever is leading the project. And of course, even if their initial vision somehow matches the end result one-to-one, games take on a life of their own after release, with their success or failure often playing a huge role in shaping the careers of its creators. Of course, any judgments I make here about a game's influence are coming from my own thoughts and views on them, or represent my best educated guesses based on the research I've done for this video. There's no way it will ever be totally exhaustive or complete. I'm bound to miss some aspect of influence that I would have found if I had known where to look. Some less important influences also might not make the cut, for whatever reason, such as me not wanting to go too far into my own speculations, or into other theories which seem to lack a solid foundation. So, having said all that, you may be asking, okay, that's all well and good, but why 1998? Well, actually that has a pretty straightforward answer. You see, what I said a while back may have been a bit misleading. My goal with this video wasn't really to try and discover what the best ever year in video games is. In fact, it was more or less the other way around. As the title suggests, I already kind of had an answer in mind to that question. Not because of some personal affinity I have for 1998 myself, but because it's the answer most commonly given whenever I see the topic discussed. This may come as news if you're of a slightly younger generation, or if you just haven't encountered many of these retrospectives. But 1998 is pretty much the go-to answer in any article, video feature, or ranked listing about the golden periods in gaming. Sites such as IGN, GamesRadar, GameSpot, GameRant, and I'm sure many others have all explicitly named 1998 as either the best or one of the best video game years ever. In 2018, The Ringer even celebrated the 20th anniversary of 98 with a series of features on some of its most memorable games that ran throughout the year. Pretty much what I'm doing here, but in a different format. So no, the statement in this video's title certainly isn't a very original one. In fact, it's arguably as predictable as they come. But as I mentioned earlier, my aim is to approach the subject from a slightly different angle, dwelling less on how good the games were, or still are, and more on what made them special at the time, and their lasting impact on the medium since then. In a way, you could also view it as my attempt to test this hypothesis, put forth by so many other commentators, to explore why they keep putting this year on such a high pedestal above many others, and find out if it's warranted. I'll go ahead and say that I actually do think it is warranted myself, and I hope that by the time this whole series is through, you'll understand why, whether you agree with me or not. So in summary, this video series will look at around 20 of the best, most iconic, and most influential games of 1998, in an attempt to show why its moniker as greatest gaming year ever is probably justified. The criteria of how good or iconic those games are will play a crucial role in determining which ones make the list, though I won't try to judge their quality myself, and generally aim to be as objective as I can. The only thing I will try to rate, or at least quantify to the best of my abilities, is the game's influence. These ratings will be pretty simple, on a scale from 1 to 5 stars, where 1 star means a game has hardly any notable influence, and 5 means it has had a huge lasting impact on the medium. Just to avoid confusion, I should add that if a game gets 3 stars, that doesn't mean it has the median amount of influence, or anything like that. In fact, it's probably more influential than about 85 to 90% of other games. Now, I could spend a lot longer on this topic, but I'll try to be brief. Basically, whether you're talking about books, movies, music, or indeed games, the odds of any one product of the medium being influential are pretty slim, and only get slimmer as that medium matures. So as you move from the foundational hits of the late 70s, through the 80s, the 90s, and eventually to now, when thousands of games are released of all shapes and sizes, on many different platforms every year, the chances of any single title having a big impact become smaller and smaller along the way. Not just because the competition is so great, making it tougher to stand out, but also simply because so many ideas have been tried and tested already, making truly new and original ones hard to come by. So bearing that in mind, and obviously I can't truly know this for sure, but my guesstimate is that around 80 to 85% of games would get a 1 or 2 star rating of influence, with 3 star games making up about 10% or so, and 4 or 5 stars going only to the relatively few games which really shook things up in a big way. So in a nutshell, the graph would look something like this. And just to reiterate, these ratings only take into account how much influence a game has had, and nothing else. A game that only gets 1 star of influence might well be one of the best games ever, or even one of my own favorites. Finally, I'd just like to say again that these ratings are just based on my best guesses of what I think a game's true influence is, and there's no way I will ever know everything there is to know on the subject, though I've certainly tried to seek out every bit of info I could find. So feel free to take my findings with a pinch of salt. Or even better, if you think I've missed something crucial, then please stick it in the comments below. And with that, my long-winded rambling intro is finally at an end. And it's time for me to...
Get on with it!
Okay, I will. God. first entry on this list of greats from 1998 is, in itself, a game of many firsts. Baldur's Gate was the first role-playing game, and only second ever game after the mech battler Shattered Steel, to come from now famed RPG developers Bioware. Founded in 1995 by two Canadian medical doctors, Ray Muzyka and Greg Zeschuk, Bioware's early days as a game studio were highly unusual. The two good doctors started with practically zero experience making games, as did nearly all of the 60 new recruits that came to work on what would become Baldur's Gate, making it very much a step into the unknown for the entire team. It was also the first big game to make use of publisher Interplay's newly acquired Dungeons & Dragons license, which to the inexperienced designers at BioWare was like a godsend. They had been big fans of tabletop games, and Dungeons & Dragons in particular, as had many higher-ups at Interplay, so the project naturally carried with it a great amount of excitement. What BioWare ended up making pushed the boundaries of computer RPGs, and was simply an extraordinary achievement considering its team of rookie developers. Using their proprietary Infinity engine, which was being built in tandem with the game itself, BioWare created a sprawling fantasy world, full of interesting characters inhabiting vibrant towns and cities, with huge stretches of peerless wilderness in between. While it was the first game made using this new engine, visually Baldur's Gate looked quite similar to two other groundbreaking RPGs from the year before, Blizzard's Diablo and Interplay's own Fallout. Like them, Baldur's Gate adopted an isometric, top-down view, a visual style which had certainly been seen in games like Ultima before then, but reached a new bar of quality in games like Diablo and Fallout. Baldur's Gate not only matched the visual fidelity of those games, but arguably even bettered them, creating a beautiful, sometimes haunting world of lush green forests, winding coastlines, and perilous caves, displaying greater variety than the multi-leveled procedural dungeon in Diablo or Fallout's bleak, irradiated desert. From isolated rural farmsteads to the grand architecture and bustling streets of its titular city, Baldur's Gate's world is one of intricate details layered on grandiose settings, conveyed on a scale seldom ever seen in games before it. Even some of the devs were taken aback by its size, as designer Dean Anderson recalls. I remember when we plotted out the total world map with dungeons and interiors, I realized the game was over 10 times the size of one of my all-time favorite games, Legend of Zelda. My mind literally imploded. While he may be using the word literally slightly liberally in this case, Anderson's reaction at the time is totally understandable. According to Ray Muzyka and Zeschuk's approximations, dividing the game world by the default screen size across which players travel, its total area adds up to around 100 times 100, or 10,000 screens. This was a role-playing game of immense size for 1998, with around 100 hours of content spread across its world, depending on how many side quests and optional interactions players chose to engage with. This of course meant an immense amount of work for the writing staff, who wrote close to 1 million words of dialogue, though thankfully for the sanity of all involved, only a small percentage of that dialogue was voice acted.
Are you talking to me? Are you talking to me?
Still, no wonder the original release of Baldur's Gate came on 5 packed CD-ROMs. But quantity means little in a game that doesn't play well though, and BioWare certainly didn't rest on their laurels on that front either. Superficially, Baldur's Gate may bear a strong resemblance to Fallout and Diablo, but in terms of gameplay, it was very different. Blizzard's action RPG dungeon crawler was by far the most accessible of the three, with its immediate, click-to-kill gameplay and addictive loot grind appealing to a larger audience. The two Interplay titles, on the other hand, were more interested in creating large, complex worlds to explore, with deep and customizable systems of character building, fueled by battle systems with a slower, more deliberate pace than Diablo. In Fallout, that led to a turn-based system using action points, while in Baldur's Gate it meant the wholesale recreation of the advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule set, with its dice rolls, saving throws and all, in a virtual space. Battles played out in a sort of hybrid system which effectively seemed to run in real time, with party members fighting automatically until given new commands, but could also be paused mid-fight to allow for strategizing without the stress of time constraints. While this may seem like an odd choice in retrospect, a sort of halfway house between real-time and turn-based combat, it meant they didn't risk alienating gamers who preferred either style. It also allowed newcomers to learn the intricacies of D&D combat at their own pace, as even veteran players could have their hands full juggling the actions of 6 different playable characters in real time. But BioWare's commitment to the Dungeons & Dragons experience wasn't limited to driving the cogs and gears of the combat system. Starting a new game, players create and name their character, choosing their gender, appearance and race, as well as class, weapon proficiencies and more, much like they would on a D&D character sheet. Finally, the player assigns its character an alignment, a sort of moral compass which reveals their core character traits. The 9 alignments in Baldur's Gate are divided along 2 axes, with lawful, neutral, and chaotic versions of good, neutral, and evil. You could choose to position yourself anywhere on this moral map, from a lawful good paragon of virtue to a chaotic evil never-do-well. Depending on the relative alignments of your main character and the other major characters you meet on your quest, the interactions between them may be very different. Pitting together 2 very misaligned characters may cause friction between them, or even result in them leaving the group. It was these sorts of character interactions and emerging dynamics between party members that set Baldur's Gate apart from other deep RPGs like Fallout, which had its own vast game world filled with interesting storylines and choices, but was first and foremost always viewed from the perspective of a single playable character. Letting players recruit a team of up to 6 characters to travel and battle alongside the protagonist allowed them to have an approximation of the D&D experience on their home computer, without having to gather 4 or 5 friends around the living room table every time. As Anderson puts it, "I think it really comes down to the characters, story, and the ability to interact with it. There had been many epic fantasy games before, but we set out to create something closer to a tabletop experience, and the nuances you get from interacting with other narratives, and an evolving story." At this point, I think it's safe to say that they more than accomplished their goal. Baldur's Gate sold over 1 million copies in its first year, and eventually reached 2 million by the early 2000s, a huge number at the time for a fairly niche genre like computer RPGs. Critically, it was very well received, winning IGN's PC Game of the Year despite some stiff competition, and many Game of the Year or RPG of the Year awards at other publications. Riding this wave of success, Bioware soon began work on Baldur's Gate II, Shadows of Amn. Now that the Infinity Engine was finished, they could simply create more and better content, resulting in a game around twice the size of the already huge original, lasting well over 200 hours in total. It also added to character depth and interactions, and introduced romance options with your companions, something which has ever since been a staple of Bioware RPGs. The general consensus around Baldur's Gate 2 is that it built on the first one and improved upon it in almost every way, and it frequently ranks high on best RPGs of all time lists, such as IGN's, where it sits at number 3 out of 100. But while a sequel may ultimately be considered the better game of the two, there's no doubt that Baldur's Gate 1 is the more influential, if purely by virtue of coming first. There had been other D&D games before it, but none had managed to simulate the pen and paper experience in such detail before, with such a rich world and sprawling storyline. In many ways, it led the charge for a new era of role-playing on PC, along with Fallout, and became a kind of template for fantasy RPGs well into the next decade. Interplay used its Infinity Engine to power the equally beloved Planescape Torment in 1999, as well as the more combat-heavy Icewind Dale games. The mid-2000s then saw a decline in isometric RPGs that lasted about a decade, until the genre was literally kickstarted back to life, thanks in part to games like Pillars of Eternity. Its 2012 Kickstarter campaign reached over $1 million in the first 24 hours, proving the insatiable appetite fans of classic RPGs such as Baldur's Gate had for those games, despite their old-school presentation. But perhaps the most obvious influence Baldur's Gate has had on gaming is in establishing Bioware as one of the most, if not the most respected creators of Western role-playing games in the 21st century. In the wake of their great success with Baldur's Gates 1 and 2, they made Neverwinter Nights in 2002, the first RPG powered by their new Aurora engine. Taking its name from a 1991 game which by many is considered the first true graphical MMO, this new Neverwinter Nights also placed great emphasis on multiplayer, and even let players create their own custom campaigns using the Aurora engine. After that came Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, a game by many considered one of the best licensed Star Wars games, and a fantastic RPG in its own right, with one of the more memorable twists in gaming history. But since then, Bioware's legacy has mainly been defined by two very different, yet also similar series, Dragon Age and Mass Effect. One is an epic fantasy RPG, which you could say is a spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate, but without the D&D license to build on, while the other is a sci-fi RPG that lets you live out your deepest Trekkie desires. Yet both continued Baldur's Gate tradition of epic tales that unfold over multiple games, letting you save your custom characters and whatever choices they make throughout the story, to carry that progress forward into each new installment. Above all, they both exemplify the core values of great storytelling, interesting characters, and meaningful player choices that define every Bioware classic. Unfortunately, since the mainline finales of both series, Mass Effect 3 and Dragon Age Inquisition, Bioware's extended golden age appears to have come to a close, or at least a temporary slump. Their two latest games, Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem, were disappointing to say the least, considering the high bar the company had set by that point. with the latter even undergoing a total rehaul in an effort to salvage it. Hopefully, Bioware can soon get over this bump in the road, but even if they can't, no one can deny their immense contribution to role-playing games over the past few decades. In a more roundabout way, Baldur's Gate might also be the reason CD Projekt Red, the Polish studio behind the Witcher series, exists as a developer today. Marcin Nowinski, founder of CD Projekt, decided he would become the first to localize games into Polish back in the 90s, when conventional game distribution wasn't really a thing in Poland, much less game development. Starting with a very simple game, an Ace Ventura movie tie-in for kids that sold a few thousand units, he soon set his sights on much bigger fish, and secured a deal with Interplay to localize and publish Baldur's Gate for the Polish audience. Their initial stock of 3,000 units sold much faster than Nowinski and his colleagues expected, as eager Polish gamers snatched up 50,000 copies within the year, and effectively legitimized the small company in the process. After this great success, they struck a deal with Interplay to port the PS2 game Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance to PC. But this project soon got cancelled due to troubles at Interplay. The seeds of game development were already sown, however, so CD Projekt Red went looking elsewhere for ideas to make their first in-house game, and found them in the Witcher series of fantasy novels by Andrzej Sapkowski. And the rest, as they say, is history. For more on the intriguing genesis of CD Projekt Red, I highly recommend NoClip's 6-part video series on the making of Witcher 3, the first part of which goes into way more detail on the founding of the studio. Last but not least, another European RPG developer, this time from Belgium, also took heavy inspiration from Baldur's Gate and other CRPGs of the late 90s. Larian Studios, headed by Sven Vinke, was founded in 1996 and licensed Dark Eye, a German fantasy property not unlike Dungeons & Dragons, to use for their first role-playing game, the brilliantly named Divine Divinity. Unfortunately, it was a bit of a mess at launch, riddled with bugs as the publisher decided to rush it out of the door in an unfinished state. Some of the developers working on it didn't even know the game had released until after the fact. Larian's sequels to the first Divinity went through similar struggles, as they fought pressure from publishers to get games out by a certain deadline. Eventually though, the studio managed to achieve independence, thanks to a combination of Kickstarter backing and other investors, and created their first self-published game, Divinity Original Sin, in 2014. Finally, they could make an RPG without any outside pressure, and it really showed. The game was a great success and heralded as a return to form for isometric RPGs, winning PC Game of the Year at GameSpot. 3 years later, the sequel was released to even greater praise, and even managed to penetrate the top 20 best PC games of all time on Metacritic, where it has settled on a score of 93. The great critical and commercial reception of their original Sin games proved Larian's credentials, and soon their talents were noticed not only by fans and critics, but by Wizards of the Coast as well, the license holders of Dungeons & Dragons, and by extension, Baldur's Gate. They were so impressed by Larian's work that they decided to honor them with that most cherished of role-playing properties. So now, more than 20 years after they started making games influenced by the first Baldur's Gate, the student has taken over the work of the master, as Larian's Baldur's Gate 3 promises to be the next true sequel in a series which had lain dormant since the turn of the century. With such a wide-ranging influence on the landscape of PC RPGs, and its role in establishing Bioware as a powerhouse studio, Baldur's Gate has had more of an impact than just about any other Western RPG I can think of. It may not have as much name recognition as other influential 90s games like Doom, Warcraft, or Street Fighter II, but even so, I think the impact it had on its own genre was just as great. Like those games, it didn't necessarily invent the genre it belonged to, as CRPGs had certainly existed before, but it did, however, become a genre-defining title by which similar games would be judged afterwards. In terms of raising the bar for high-fantasy Western RPGs, and successfully transmuting the D&D experience into the digital realm, Baldur's Gate did more than any other. It became a prototype of sorts for many CRPGs after it, and not just those that utilized its Infinity engine, establishing norms around both visuals and gameplay that have actually become fashionable again in recent years. Perhaps due to nostalgia, or maybe just because its template still works so well even today. For all of those reasons, I think its influence definitely deserves the highest rating I have to give.
war never changes. The end of the world occurred pretty much as we had predicted. Too many humans, not enough space or resources to go around.
As I mentioned briefly in the last part, another CRPG was being developed at Interplay even before work started on Baldur's Gate, and its second installment also came out in 1998, namely Fallout 2. But to say anything meaningful about the sequel is hard without mentioning first the game that started it all, the original Fallout, which came out in 1997. Today it's known as the progenitor of one of the greatest Western RPG franchises, but it started from rather humble beginnings, as an after-hours passion project for a few ambitious members of Interplay. Producer Tim Kaine had sent out an email to his fellow developers, inviting them to free pizza after work to brainstorm over a new game idea, perhaps built on an engine which Kaine had partially written already. The response was fairly underwhelming, as Kaine recalls. I expected there to be 20 or 30 people packed into that conference room because, hey, we can make whatever we want. Instead, there were maybe 8 or 10. Those hungry but committed few weren't sure what to make at first, and flirted briefly with the idea of a multi-dimensional, time-traveling detective game with talking dinosaurs, but soon settled on something slightly less silly, a post-apocalyptic, 50s-styled vision of America, ravaged by nuclear war, where survivors either dwell in isolated vaults underground, or try to survive amidst the mutated wildlife and other unwelcome inhabitants on the surface. Their inspirations for this vision included movies like the Mad Max trilogy, and 50s sci-fi such as Forbidden Planet, but also the 1988 game Wasteland, an early Interplay title created by Brian Fargo, one of the company's founders. He had long wanted to create a sequel to it, but had lost the rights to Electronic Arts, so Fallout instead became a kind of reimagining of it, as Fargo notes. I think the things that intrigued me about the game were the same that intrigued me about Wasteland. When we sat down to do Fallout, we went through and analyzed all the things we thought made Wasteland resonate. Those were meaningful cause and effect, a bleak universe, morally grey areas. To me, it was all of those things. With the support of Fargo, who would finally get his successor to Wasteland, Tim Kaine and his team set out to create their own irradiated Wasteland, with those elements serving to guide the design of their new project.
You're here. Good. We've got a problem. A big one. The controller chip for our water purification system has given up the ghost.
Originally, they were also going to implement the pen and paper GURPS, or Generic Universal Role-Playing System, as the basic rule set for the game, which Interplay had already acquired the license for in 1994. But after some disagreements with Steve Jackson Games, the GURPS license holder, they decided to drop the system, rather than compromise on their vision. That left the team to find some new attribute system to replace it, so they made their own, called Special, and combined it with player skills, traits, and perks, allowing players unprecedented freedom to shape and specialize their character. The 7 basic attributes of Special were Strength, Perception, Endurance, Charisma, Intelligence, Agility, and Luck, were the most important, serving as the most general indicator of a character's talents. The 18 player skills showed their aptitude within more specific areas, like hacking, wielding specific weapon types, repairing, or bartering, and are affected by Special but can also be increased independently. Traits were then introduced as a third variable, as the team wanted an aspect of character creation and progression that didn't just confer advantages. Unlike Special and player skills, traits aren't shown as a statistic, but serve as a kind of specialization with trade-offs between positive and negative effects, such as small frame, which increases agility at the expense of carrying capacity, or heavy-handed, which increases melee weapon damage, but makes critical hits less likely. This new system of character building gave players a deep level of personalization, making it highly unlikely for any 2 players to end up with the exact same build. The same could be said for other games that throw lots of statistics and skill points around, but unlike most of them, Fallout's attributes didn't just affect combat. In fact, both Fallouts 1 and 2 can be finished without killing almost anyone, by choosing to specialize in skills like sneaking, lockpicking, or speech, for example, which may present non-violent paths through situations that at first seem destined for conflict. In some less obvious ways, the 7 core special attributes also have a significant impact on how your character interacts with the world. Having a high luck stat can lead some players to stumble upon wreckages filled with unique loot out in the wastes, which those with less luck might never encounter. Alternatively, having very low intelligence can give you a pretty rough, but also hilarious time, turning your character into a bumbling caveman who only communicates in toddler speak, and is likewise spoken to as if they were a child, by those patient enough to try.
Here is a shiny bottle. Vic gave us this. Vic. He is a trader in Klamath. Klamath. Go to Vic, find Vault 13, find Gek, come home. Do your best, child.
And since most quests require speaking to people to either start or complete them, being too stupid can actually lock players out of most optional quests, unless their character literally wises up.
You have stupid spirits. Go see shaman. Get hole in head. Big hole. Very big. Huge.
While it may seem like I've just been going on about the first Fallout, everything I've just described applies pretty much equally to Fallout 2. In a way, the second Fallout was to the first exactly what Baldur's Gate 2 was to Baldur's Gate. As with Bioware's game, the first Fallout went through a long development phase of about 3 years, as the engine behind it was being created at the same time as the game itself. Having finished the first game, Interplay could then use that completed engine to create the sequel, freeing up time and resources to simply make more content. As in more towns, more characters and quests, and a whole lot more of that dark humor Fallout is famous for.
Jealous? His name's Herbert. I talk to him when I get lonely.
And that's just what they did, creating in just over a year a game around twice the size of the first, with a lot more to see and do, without really changing much in terms of gameplay. As they say, if it ain't broke, why fix it? The result is a sequel generally considered an improvement upon the first, and for many longtime Fallout fans, it remains to this day a high point in the series. In part, that status is earned by Fallout 2's own greatness, and partly because of how the series developed after it. Straying far from its strength of richly interactive role-playing, the next step for Fallout was to ignore those strengths completely in favor of some tactical squad shooting, with Fallout Tactics in 2001 and Brotherhood of Steel a few years later. Besides these two spin-offs, there was a general lack of Fallout in the new millennium, until Bethesda acquired the rights to the franchise and brought it fully into the third dimension with Fallout 3 in 2008. Using their engine for the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion as a base, they built their own version of the Wasteland, this time set in Washington, D.C. instead of the West Coast, creating a seamless open world viewed in first person rather than the old isometric style. It was an immediate hit, rated very highly among critics, and even won a number of Game of the Year awards. In terms of sales, it vastly outsold its predecessors, eventually shipping well over 10 million copies, and created a new generation of Fallout fans in its wake, though not without alienating a few existing fans in the process. In general, the reception to Bethesda's Fallout titles has been good, with one very notable exception. But there's no denying their approach has split the fanbase somewhat, and created a desire among a small yet vocal group of fans for a return to the roots of the series. When it comes to the influence of Fallout 2, and separating it from that of its predecessor, it's hard to see how it changed the formula in any meaningful way. However, it definitely represented a changing of the guard within Interplay, giving some fresh talents their chance to shine. After the lengthy development of the first Fallout, 3 of its lead designers, Tim Kaine, Leonard Boyarsky, and Jason Anderson, decided to move on to new things. So they left Interplay a few months into development of Fallout 2 and founded Troika Studios, using their newfound independence to create original RPGs such as Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, and Vampire the Masquerade, a cult favorite whose sequel is finally set to release in 2021. Their departure from Interplay opened the doors for the likes of Fergus Urquhart and Chris Avallone to take over as lead designers. Urquhart was at that time leading the newly formed Black Isle Studios, Interplay's in-house RPG division, which alongside Fallout 2 made games such as Icewind Dale and Planescape Torment, on which Avallone served as lead designer. Their experience working on Fallout 2 undoubtedly shaped their careers moving forward, with echoes of its darkly humorous narrative and unique characters, showing in Avallone's writing in Torment, for example, a game with a strong focus on dialogue and progressing through words and actions other than fighting. Following Black Isle's closure in 2003, Urquhart and Avallone then also decided to head for pastures new, and started Obsidian Entertainment with a few of their colleagues. At first, Obsidian made a name for itself, crafting sequels to successful games from Bioware and other studios, including Knights of the Old Republic 2 and Neverwinter Nights 2, before making their first original game in the spy RPG Alpha Protocol. Whilst working on that title, they were contacted by Bethesda, who commissioned them to create a new entry in the Fallout series, while they focused on the next Elder Scrolls. Giving Obsidian free reign over the Fallout 3 engine, Bethesda placed their faith in the old Fallout veterans, trusting that their great experience and knowledge of the franchise would lead them to make something good. The result, Fallout New Vegas, proved that their trust was well founded, as many fans consider it superior even to any of Bethesda's efforts in the series, despite it being one of the most famously bug-riddled games ever made. New Vegas was especially praised for its writing and quest design. Amongst other things, it brought back factions in a much bigger way, such as the slave traders and wannabe Imperial Romans of the Legion, and its quests saw you do crazy things like trying to save a man's son from being the main course in a cannibalist fancy dress party. If that sounds the least bit interesting to you, I highly recommend checking out this video from Game Maker's Toolkit, which explores 5 very different ways that single questline can be completed, depending on how you choose to tackle it. Although New Vegas is to this day their sole contribution to Fallout, the legacy of the franchise can still be felt within Obsidian today. Their 2019 release, The Outer Worlds, is essentially a competitor to Bethesda's 3D Fallouts, often knowingly referred to by fans as Fallout in Space. Its satirical vision of capitalism taken to extremes echoes the brutal every man for himself world of Fallout, while instead of parodying 50s cultural tropes, it chose to infuse its frontier space setting with more of a Western feel, sort of like the early 2000s sci-fi show Firefly. It also happened to be a reunion of sorts for Fallout's creators, with Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky taking the helm as the game's directors, having joined their old pal Urquhart at Obsidian in 2011 and 2016 respectively. With so many of its key figures going on to create the great CRPGs of the 21st century, Fallout 2's credits read like a veritable who's who of role-playing royalty. That includes Brian Fargo, who finally managed to get his hands on the Wasteland license after leaving Interplay, and released Wasteland 2 in 2014 with the help of a Kickstarter campaign that reached $1 million in only 2 days, proving there was still great demand from fans for games in the style of older Fallouts, which themselves, of course, based much of that style on Brian Fargo's original Wasteland, as mentioned earlier. Beyond their influence on the developers who worked on them, Fallouts 1 and 2 have also served to inspire many other recent games. Today there are plenty of post-apocalyptic, isometric RPGs that clearly take inspiration from Interplay's early classics, showcasing the deep love many fans, some of whom later became developers, still have for the likes of Fallout 2, more than 2 decades after it first came out. As Interplay were finishing up Fallout 2, way on the other side of the Pacific, the Japanese masters at Capcom were about to release a sequel of their own, though theirs was less of a post-apocalypse and more, well, zombie apocalypse. In 1996, their seminal PlayStation game Resident Evil came out and changed the horror genre for good, by creating a whole new subgenre called survival horror, which the series has been synonymous with ever since. Before then, horror games had existed, but in relatively few numbers. Perhaps because scaring gamers in 2D was no easy task, and 3D graphics before 96 were still very rudimentary. More than most other gaming genres, horror has always benefited greatly from increased visual fidelity, with the interplay of flickering light and shadows becoming ever more believable as graphics improve. After all, if your mutated freak or menacing killer looks like a jumble of vaguely blood-spattered triangles, or even an 8-bit sprite, it's harder for players to take it seriously, much less feel truly afraid of it. To be fair, Capcom's original survival horror doesn't quite hold up by modern standards, but in the mid-90s, its shuffling zombies were the things of gamers' nightmares. And unlike watching a scary movie, playing Resident Evil meant you had to deal with them yourself. What added even more to the tension was the survival aspect of survival horror. Although player characters had guns, and eventually a pretty powerful arsenal of weapons, resources like health and ammo were constantly in short supply. You might not be that afraid of a lone zombie by the time you shot, stabbed, or run past 15 of them already. But did you have enough bullets to deal with it now, as it shuffles ever closer, blocking the path forward as a pack of undead dogs closes in from behind? Even saving the game was turned into a stress-inducing form of resource management, as you couldn't do so without collecting ink ribbons, which came in limited supply, and could only be used in specific save rooms. Releasing only 2 years after the first, Resident Evil 2 built on this structure while improving and expanding upon it in many ways. Moving from a spooky isolated mansion in the Raccoon City outskirts to the city itself, where the T-Virus starts wreaking havoc on a much larger scale. Like in Resident Evil 1, players can choose between 2 protagonists, assuming the role of either Claire Redfield, sister of Chris from the first game, or the rookie cop Leon Kennedy, with the two scenarios presenting slightly different variations on the same overarching plot. Entering Raccoon City just as the residents are becoming evil. Players navigate their way through its chaotic city streets, slaloming past burning car wreckages and narrow back alleys until they reach the RCBD headquarters, then eventually into the city sewers and beyond. This was a pretty big departure from Resident Evil 1, which effectively all took place in a single residence of the mansion, albeit a very large mansion with many hidden secrets in its depths. Besides changing up the setting, Resident Evil 2 made a number of significant contributions in other areas. For starters, it changed up one of the most infamous aspects of the first game, the cringe-worthy live-action FMVs, which proudly stand as some of the worst acting in all of video game history. As the story goes, Capcom put out a casting call for Western actors, and simply hired the first people who answered, resulting in, well, this. For the second game, they decided to go the route of many other AAA games of the era, replacing the live-action FMVs with cutscenes that gelled better with the in-game presentation. The voice acting was this time outsourced to a recording studio outside of Japan, and improved considerably. It still kept some cheesy dialogue.
Hold your fire! I'm a human!
Sorry about that.
But for better or worse, it had nothing on the level of...
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
Overall, between games 1 and 2, Capcom simply raised the quality across the board, not so much through drastic changes, but rather through incremental improvements to the art design and atmosphere, for example. Limited by the early PlayStation hardware, many games of that era decided to use static pre-rendered backgrounds to give their environments greater fidelity and detail than the blocky 3D textures of the time ever could, even if it meant that character models and other 3D elements would sometimes stand out against the prettier backdrops. The first Resident Evil was among the early adopters of this technique, but many of its environments were fairly bland rooms and corridors, and often seemed strangely well lit for a spooky horror game. Resident Evil 2 definitely improved in this regard, with more atmospheric environments that actually felt dark and foreboding, enhanced by subtle lighting effects that contributed to its more realistic feel. The zombies and other enemies also received a visual upgrade, and added some much needed variety to their models, which made sense now that the T-Virus had a whole city's worth of victims to feast on. Beyond its returning cast of undead creeps and rotting canines, it also introduced some new horrors to the mix, many of which are among the most memorable and iconic in the series. Replacing the first game's reptilian hunters, RE2 introduced the grotesque lickers, terrifying but sightless wall crawlers that will tear your face off at the slightest sound, encouraging players to tiptoe their way past as cautiously as the old school tank controls would allow. Or you could just blast them with a shotgun if you were feeling brave. Speaking of bravery, you are going to need plenty of it if you happen to run into the imposing Mr. X, a 10-foot tall cross between a film noir detective and the Kool-Aid Man.
Oh yeah!
You would let nothing get in between him and his target, not even the pre-rendered walls, so that previously abandoned, seemingly safe hallways didn't feel that safe anymore. When it released, Resident Evil 2 was an immediate smash hit, selling 5 million copies on the first PlayStation, nearly twice as many as the original, and was for a long time the best-selling RE on a single platform. Capitalizing on this success, Capcom ported it to pretty much every platform that could handle it at the time: Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, PC, and GameCube a few years later. A pretty rare fate for a console game back when platform exclusivity was the norm rather than the exception. After it, the series gradually became more and more action-packed, starting the next year with Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, a game set in Raccoon City both before and after the events of 2. It moved the action onto the more expansive city streets, and added new moves like a last-second dodge, a useful skill to have while evading the titular Nemesis, a relentless foe that evokes other unstoppable brutes from horror, such as Leatherface and Jason Voorhees. This focus on action only increased with Resident Evil 4, which revolutionized not only the franchise, but third-person action gaming in general, with its literal shift of perspective. While 4 was undeniably a great game, many felt the series was losing its identity somewhat over time, especially as 5 and 6 went for bombastic Hollywood action at the expense of fear. Not to mention the flood of spin-offs and light gun games that often felt like cynical cash-ins with little connection to survival horror. In a way then, Resident Evil 2 represents the last great entry in the series faithful to its original formula, before it started branching off into various other subgenres, spin-offs and action-packed sequels. It came as little surprise, therefore, when Capcom announced in 2015 that they would remake it for modern audiences, using their new RE engine, first seen in Resident Evil 7. In fact, Capcom had planned to do so for a while, after their successful GameCube remake of the first Resident Evil in 2002, a game which still looks amazing to this day thanks to its great pre-rendered environments, but decided to put those plans on hold while they finished up RE4. Unlike that remake though, the 2019 version of Resident Evil 2 made more fundamental gameplay changes, not just improving the visuals, but replacing the old tank controls with a more fluid movement and aiming system introduced in RE4. Like its inspiration, the remake did extremely well both critically and commercially, outselling the original PlayStation version in less than a year, and proving that one of the greats from '98 could still kick it with the best of them over 2 decades later. Beyond the series itself, the early Resident Evils also influenced several other Capcom games in the following years, as their pre-rendered backgrounds and tank control movement became a template for some future projects. In 1999, Capcom released Dino Crisis, which was similar enough to its zombie sibling series that it was immediately labeled Resident Evil with dinosaurs. Although being chased by massive extinct beasts instead of shuffling corpses naturally give it a very different kind of intensity. The action-packed Dino Crisis 2 soon followed, and continued Capcom's trend of giving players control over 2 characters of either sex, Dylan and Regina from the first game, though it departed from RE's 1 and 2 by having you play as both throughout the campaign, instead of choosing one from the start. Moving on to the next generation with PlayStation 2, Capcom turned to demon-slaying action in feudal Japan with the Onimusha series. While they weren't exactly survival horror games, they also retained tank control movement and pre-rendered environments for the first few entries, with some great looking results for the time, until Onimusha 3 ditched both in favor of true 3D environments, smoother controls, and John Reno? Where was I? Oh yeah. The success of the early Resident Evils had a big effect on Capcom's output in the immediate future, with traces of their DNA appearing in many other franchises. Dino Crisis and Onimusha may exhibit those traces most clearly, but they can also be seen elsewhere, like in the more light-hearted zombie-slaying mayhem of Dead Rising, a game which feels like it was designed to be the polar opposite of Resident Evil, as it allowed players a cathartic release from survival horror by giving them a whole mall's worth of resources to mow down a much less frightening zombie horde. Outside of Capcom, the first few Resident Evils also had a significant impact on other games, and were probably largely responsible for revitalizing the horror genre as a whole. To name but one example, in 1999 Konami put their own spin on survival horror with the first Silent Hill. Its general ambience and storyline were quite different, veering more into psychological terror and mystery, and the protagonist was a regular Joe searching for his missing daughter, as opposed to RE's highly trained STARS agents. Even so, it retains the uncomfortable, restrictive controls and elaborate puzzles of Resident Evil, and has ever since been the only serious competitor to Capcom's horror game crown. Fans of the genre often align themselves to one camp or the other, depending on their preference for survival horror or Silent Hill's slower-burning psycho terror. But whichever you prefer, in terms of both popularity and longevity, there really is no contest. Resident Evil has sold far more over its dozens of titles, and is still going strong today, whereas Konami's series has gone well and truly silent since 2015. For one Capcom employee in particular, Resident Evil 2 was especially important, and served as the first big step towards an illustrious career. After the unofficial father of Resident Evil, Shinji Mikami, decided to change his role from director on the first game to producer on the second, he needed to find a suitable replacement for RE2. He chose the 25-year-old Hideki Kamiya, who admits he was never a huge fan of horror himself, preferring Hollywood action films. The development didn't go entirely smoothly at first, but helped by the guiding hand of Mikami and writer Nobuo Sugimura, the young Kamiya eventually passed his first directorial test with flying colors, and was soon given the chance to direct RE4. Fans of the series may know that the eventual 2005 release of Resident Evil 4 had little to do with that early project, But let's just say that what Kamiya was making back then was something very different from the 3 previous games. So different, in fact, that his mentor Mikami suggested he turn his concept into a whole other game, which turned into 2001 action classic Devil May Cry. In hindsight, it's hard to imagine it having any connection to Resident Evil at all. One is a slow-paced horror game with stiff controls, where you seldom have enough resources to deal with every enemy you come across, while the other is a fast-paced slasher with fluid movement, where your guns have literally infinite ammo. Despite that, you can still find traces of RE in its gothic horror setting and puzzle design, although such elements have become less and less important in later games. On every project since then, Kamiya has always strived to make original work with his own distinct flavor, such as Beautiful Joe and the visually striking Okami. In 2007, both he and Mikami left Capcom to form Platinum Games, a studio which is specialized in the kind of stylish action madness popularized by Devil May Cry, in games like Kamiya's own Bayonetta series, Mikami's Vanquish, Metal Gear Rising, and Nier Automata. So without Kamiya's first directing gig in 1998, his mutated RE4 concept, and the string of original works that followed, the world of action gaming would probably look a lot different today, and I don't think for the better. All in all, Resident Evil 2's trail of influences extends far and wide, and the fact that it managed to be both one of the most popular games in 1998 and in 2019 speaks volumes. Crack open any list of best horror games, and odds are you'll find it sitting confidently somewhere near the top. And that's without even mentioning its impact outside of video games, on other areas of pop culture. The Resident Evil franchise is one of those rare few which have managed to become recognized even by non-gamers, mainly thanks to the many film adaptations since 2002. Even before then, however, it was directly referenced in an episode of cult classic TV show Spaced.
Don't sneak up on me like that!
Want a cup of tea?
Yes.
Which, according to director Edgar Wright, may have indirectly led to the creation of the zombie parody Shaun of the Dead, his first feature film. So, am I saying that without Resident Evil 2 there's no Shaun of the Dead? Well, to be fair, Wright's fondness for the likes of Dawn of the Dead and George A. Romero's other zombie classics probably had more to do with it. But still, Capcom's game may have played some small role. Speaking of George Romero, he was in fact briefly involved with the series at one point, directing a live-action TV advert for Resident Evil 2, which only aired in Japan. This brief collaboration could have turned into something greater, as Romero was initially set to direct the first movie adaptation of the series, a project which entered pre-production shortly after RE2 hit the shelves. But his early script ideas, which actually stuck pretty close to the events and characters of the first 2 games, were rejected around 2000, and Capcom decided to replace him with Paul W.S. Anderson, who then proceeded to make 6 films starring his wife Mila Jovovich that had almost nothing whatsoever to do with the games they were based on.
You gotta be kidding me.
In terms of overall impact, Resident Evil 2 undoubtedly made a big splash, and you could even argue it represented the biggest single leap for the franchise in terms of success, outselling the first game nearly 2-1 on the PlayStation. While it didn't evolve the gameplay too much, it changed its presentation in terms of cinematics and improved in most areas, setting the standard for many of Capcom's titles of the era, both within the series and outside of it. But in terms of game design, was it the most influential Resident Evil? Well, probably not. The first one, a game usually regarded as the quote-unquote father of survival horror, probably deserves to rank higher. As does the fourth, which literally brought a fresh perspective to not only horror, but third-person action games more generally. Still, taking a bronze medal in the most popular and iconic horror franchise in video game history means it's right up there with the most influential horror games of all time. It may not be quite enough to earn it the maximum 5 stars, but definitely comes close. While Capcom were busy releasing a sequel to their new PlayStation series, Konami were doing the same for their 1995 game, Suikoden. Although it was one of the first titles on the PlayStation, whose main selling point was the promise of games with 3D graphics, Suikoden decided to stick almost entirely with 2D visuals, which had reached their 16-bit pinnacle in Super Nintendo classics, such as Chrono Trigger. Suikoden II was released 3 years after the first, and stuck with his formula, even as many other JRPGs tried their hand at 3D with relative success. Their older style of presentation may have cost them slightly in marketing terms, but foregoing the third dimension allowed Suikoden and its sequel to focus their resources on increasing the game's scope, crafting both a massive world and a frankly obscenely large cast of characters, which would have taken far longer to create if Konami had chosen polygonal models over 2D sprites. Much like the original, Suikoden II takes its inspiration from the Chinese classical novel called This, which in English translates as Water Margin, and in Japanese as Suikoden. This novel dates back to the 14th century, and tells of the so-called 108 Stars of Destiny, a group of 108 outlaws who band together to fight a common enemy after their release from prison. While only loosely based on this myth, Suikoden II nevertheless sets its sights higher than most, taking this legend of the Stars of Destiny and literally turning them into 108 separate recruitable characters. Naturally, most of those characters are entirely optional, and often play at best a supporting role in the core narrative, which follows the protagonist Ryu as he gathers a force strong enough to stand up to Prince Luca Blight, the sadistic heir to the Highland Empire. While this conflict represents the main through line of the plot, Ryu's epic quest branches out from it to incorporate the political intrigue and dramas of many other townships and characters, which more often than not leads to some of them joining your cause. While the game can be completed without searching out every single character, those tenacious enough to try are rewarded with the game's so-called true ending, one of 3 possible endings to the game. This is no easy task, however, as some characters can be missed entirely if not recruited at certain points, while others need very specific requirements to be met before joining, making it extremely difficult to obtain the full roster of allies without consulting a guide. You may be wondering then, for a game with such a bonkers amount of characters, can they really all be playable? Well, not quite it turns out, but there's still a surprisingly large proportion that you can use in combat, around 80 out of the 108 in total. But that's where it gets a bit more complicated, as Suikoden II reveals another aspect of itself which makes it stand out from its peers. Unlike the average JRPG, which generally just has one battle mode, Suikoden II has 3 separate modes, each operating on a different scale with its own battle mechanics. Duels are the most intimate, 1 versus 1 battles, where Ryu goes up against another opponent in a kind of rock-paper-scissors contest, usually in service of important story beats, or when Ryu is trying to recruit an ally who needs proof of his skills. Then there's the more conventional JRPG battle system, where you control a squad of up to 6 party members, 3 in front and 3 in the back row, as they fight against a similarly small group of monsters, human enemies, or screen-filling bosses. Something no self-respecting JRPG can be seen without. Finally, there's the full-on war mode, which makes a return from Suikoden I in a new and updated form. Instead of simply leading a single massive horde of combatants against a similarly large force, issuing commands to the entire battalion at once, Suikoden II expanded the battlefield and added more nuance to the tactical skirmishes. Now the player could control multiple units and move them about the battlefield, in a style closer to Fire Emblem or more conventional turn-based strategy games. These strategic battles aren't merely mini-games to add a bit of variety, however, but play a crucial role in the narrative. Many of the characters who join your merry band can be assigned to lead their own squadrons, but unlike in normal battles, dying in these large-scale conflicts can mean losing characters permanently, lending them a far greater sense of urgency and weight than your average encounter. Suikoden II is different from many other games on this list, because odds are high that you may have never even heard of it. Although it was critically well received, it didn't make a huge splash commercially, perhaps being a fairly tough sell for audiences who by that time expected their PlayStation 1 games to come in 3 dimensions. It didn't help its overseas sales either that it came out in September of '99 in the US, the same month as Final Fantasy VIII, perhaps the most anticipated JRPG sequel of all time. In terms of presentation, the 2 games could hardly be more different, with Squaresoft turning the profits from their mega hit Final Fantasy VII into some of the most beautiful visuals seen on console to that point, especially in the jaw-dropping FMV cutscenes. With Konami's title keeping alive the 2D aesthetics of the last generation, it must have been hard to compete, with JRPGs only just emerging from niche status outside their home country at the time. By the time Konami stopped printing copies for release, Suikoden II had only managed to sell around 700,000 worldwide, with around half of those sales coming from Japan. In fact, Konami chose to discontinue the game unusually early due to this lackluster response, and ever since the game has gained a somewhat legendary status for its rarity. Before it was digitally re-released on PSN in 2014, prospective buyers could expect to fork out $100 or more for a physical copy on eBay. And if anything, the prices have just gotten even more ridiculous since then, turning a pristine boxed copy of Suikoden II into one of the most valuable collector's items in all of video gaming. The second Suikoden may not have been a resounding commercial success at the time, falling into relative obscurity among those who didn't get to play it when it first released. Nevertheless, Suikoden II is undoubtedly a cult classic, a game truly beloved by its fans. Among that devoted fanbase are IGN's Jared Petty and Jason Schreier, former editor of Kotaku, both of whom wrote articles praising it as one of the all-time great JRPGs. Personally, I never got to experience Suikoden II's charms at the time, so who better to explain its greatness than two of its biggest fans, one of whom even calls it his favorite game of all time. Over to you, Jason. It's a journey that is simultaneously grandiose and intimate, somehow juggling both sweeping political machinations and close personal friendships without missing a beat. There's a villain, Luca Blight, who ranks among the most terrifying creatures to ever appear in a video game. The characters are lovely, the story can be heartbreaking. It looks great, it sounds great, the combat is really satisfying, there's a cooking minigame, there are flying squirrels, there's friendship and betrayal and love and death. Also, you get to run your own castle. Speaking of castles, both Schreier and Petty point out the game's similarity to a certain long-running HBO series that I've heard was pretty popular, as Jared Petty describes. With shifting alliances, constant betrayals, and complex political intrigue, the story of Suikoden II draws from the best traditions of Machiavellian literature. Add Peter Dinklage and a few more dragons, and you've pretty much got Game of Thrones. Best friends become bitter enemies, morality is constantly in question, plot twists happen at the most unexpected times, and even the most ethical players are hard-pressed to tell right from wrong. Assassination, war, and treaty are all tools of statecraft, and the ever-changing landscape and story is refreshingly unpredictable. And in true George R.R. Martin fashion, no one is ever safe. Beloved and reviled characters can, and will, fall at any time. Suikoden II was not the last in the series, with a trio of sequels coming out on PlayStation 2 and moving the franchise into 3D at last, but none of them fared much better commercially than their predecessors. And to this day, the general consensus among its fans is that 2 remains the best. It has certainly inspired a loyal and passionate fanbase, but it's hard to see it as a great influence over later games. Not many RPGs since have had the audacity to include over 100 playable characters, although Chrono Cross was bold enough to go for 40. And Radiata Stories upped the ante to over 170 recruitable characters within its slightly goofy Civil War tale, although you have to play the game at least twice to collect them all. In its own way, the recent Ni no Kuni 2 also echoes Suikoden's blend of small-scale personal stories with large-scale conflicts, as young hero Evan combines his fairy tale quest of friendship and virtues with the duties of a king leading his troops into battle, and features both typical small-party battles and larger-scale battles between armies. Traces of kingdom building and warring factions can in fact be seen widely throughout JRPGs, especially in the subgenre known as tactical RPGs, but probably owe more to the influence of the ever-popular Fire Emblem series, or games like Final Fantasy Tactics. But Suikoden II's particular narrative blend of high-stakes drama and political scheming with a more personal tale of Ryu, his sister Nanami and his childhood friend Jowie, told not only through the story but gameplay as well, is hard to find in other titles. Much like it was in 1998, Suikoden II remains, along with the others in its franchise, a fairly unique experience, and one which very few developers have tried to emulate. Well, aside from Suikoden's own series creator Yoshitaka Murayama, who just recently completed a successful Kickstarter campaign for his new project, Eiyuden Chronicle, a spiritual successor of sorts to his earlier franchise, bringing back the style, structure, and massive cast list of Suikoden, and is set to release in October 2022. But until then, Suikoden II still has few imitators, which combined with its relative obscurity, suggests that it probably didn't influence other games in a big way. Nevertheless, despite lacking any clear evidence, I strongly suspect its ambitious design must have inspired many who played it back in the day, and even if it didn't, it remains to this day an iconic member of a golden age for JRPGs. Speaking of Japanese games that let you collect over 100 characters, you can probably guess where I'm going with this, right? Yep, it's time for Pokémon. Or to be more precise, the third entry in Game Freak's ultra-popular series, Pokémon Yellow for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Now, I must admit I made a bit of a mistake as I was planning this video series. For some reason I got it into my head that 98 was the year the Pokémon game franchise started. In fact, Pokémon's Red and Green, as the first games were called in Japan, came out there in 1996. I wasn't entirely off the mark though, since the English translations of those games, which became Red and Blue for Western audiences, did come out in 1998 in the US and slightly later in Europe. 98 was also the year of the first Pokémon movie, named Pokémon the First Movie, which continued the story of trainer Ash Ketchum and his faithful Pikachu, and their pals Misty and Brock, which Japanese audiences had been introduced to the year before in the animated series. So all in all, a pretty big year for Pokémon, without even taking into account the other aspects of Pokémania, such as trading cards, toys, and other merchandise which helped fuel the craze around that time. But anyway, the only Pokémon game to actually release in 98 was Pokémon Yellow, so let's get right into it. Much like Red and Blue are just minor alterations of each other, with slightly different sets of Pokémon, Yellow represents a third version of what is essentially the same game, though it has often been considered a spin-off because of the minor changes it makes to the standard formula. Unlike Red or Blue, or any of the mainline Pokémon games since, Yellow doesn't let you choose from one of 3 starter Pokémon, but instead pairs you up with the iconic Pikachu whether you like it or not. Also, unlike those other games, your Pikachu will follow you around on the field screen, and can be interacted with at any time. Doing so will prompt Pikachu to express his or her feelings toward the trainer, which may change depending on how players utilize them in battle. This was pretty much the first time the games tried to instill a greater sense of individual personality in the trainer's Pokémons, where before they had pretty much just been obedient fighting creatures with no real expressions outside of their battle cries. This added focus on Pikachu and his connection to the trainer was the first big step taken to connect the games with the other elements of Pokémania, especially the long-running anime series, which began in 1997 and is still going strong today, more than 1,000 episodes later. It is the plot of the anime's first season which Yellow borrows as its own, effectively overlaying it onto the gameplay structure of Red and Blue. Besides portraying the camaraderie of the trainer and his faithful Pikachu, Yellow also has characters such as Nurse Joy, Officer Jenny, and the dastardly Team Rocket, who alongside their talking Meowth attempt to thwart the player's progress at every turn, just like in the show. Its ties to the greater Pokémon universe didn't stop with the TV series though. Its release in Japan was planned to complement the debut of the first Pokémon movie, with the game and movie releasing only 2 months apart. A special Yellow Pikachu edition of the Game Boy Color came out as well, and was bundled with the game. To help promote it, Nintendo even collaborated with Volkswagen to create a special version of their new Beetle dressed in Pikachu livery. With all arms of the Pokémon marketing machine in full swing, it will come as a surprise to nobody that Pokémon Yellow did pretty well for itself. Its global lifetime sales are just shy of 15 million units, which may in fact make it the best-selling Pokémon game of all time. There's no denying then that Pokémon Yellow was an extremely popular game, and also fairly highly rated by critics, who mostly gave it scores on par with Red and Blue, while some criticized it for its lack of new additions. But was it influential? Well, the way I see it, if you count it as part of the original run of first-generation games, then most definitely, given the impact Pokémon has had not only on games, but on entertainment more generally. Its addictive monster collecting and training gameplay took the world by storm in a way no RPG has done since, and the series has probably served as a gateway drug into JRPGs more than any other, due to its accessible and family-friendly nature. Ever since the runaway success of those early games, monster collecting and commanding them in battle has become an increasingly common sight in JRPGs, whether as optional side activities or as a core feature of gameplay. Ni no Kuni, a collaboration between Level 5 and the legendary animators at Studio Ghibli, lifts much of its gameplay loop pretty much straight from Pokémon. Although the beautifully hand-drawn Ghibli-esque narrative centers more around protagonist Oliver and his quest to return home from a magical fantasy realm, its battle system has you taming a bestiary of familiars that runs into the hundreds, with each familiar evolving into new, more powerful forms, just like in Pokémon. Then there's Dragon Quest VIII, that lets players capture certain monsters to fight for them in arena battles against other monster teams, sorta like gym battles in Pokémon, if the world had only one gym, and that gym were a coliseum. However, monster taming has been a part of the series since Dragon Quest V in 1992, well before the first Pokémon came out, so it may well be that Game Freak's Critter Collectathon was in fact inspired by Dragon Quest, not the other way around. Then again, in 1998, Enix released their first spin-off game focused purely on capturing monsters, literally called Dragon Quest Monsters, so maybe the influence flows both ways after all. Another game which might have had some Pokémon influence is Final Fantasy VIII. Released in 1999, nearly every NPC in the game could be challenged to a game of Triple Triad. Its collection of over 100 cards, representing every single monster type encountered in the game, as well as many of the most important characters. A year later, Final Fantasy IX continued this trend with its slightly different card game, Tetramaster. Is the huge popularity of Pokémon trading cards to blame for these minigames, or just a total coincidence? Honestly, I have no idea, but my personal guess is that it probably was no accident. There's no denying that Pokémon is today a worldwide phenomenon, and that the most important games in establishing its dominance are those of the first generation. Whether or not you count Yellow among that generation is up for debate, but it certainly played its part to broaden the game's appeal and gave those who first encountered Pokémon through the animated series a chance to live out that story on their Game Boy. The first Pokémon games for the Nintendo Switch, Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, were 3D remakes of Yellow, celebrating the 20th anniversary of its release, and served as a stopgap for Pokémon fans waiting for the next true sequels in the series, Pokémon Sword and Shield, which released the year after. So it certainly has had an impact on the series, besides being the first game to establish more direct ties with TV, films, and other elements of the Pokémon universe. That expanded universe has since grown to become one of the biggest media franchises in the world, seeing a massive resurgence in popularity thanks to Pokémon Go on mobile devices in 2016. But even without the huge player base of that free-to-play game, the mainline series of Pokémon games, releasing on all of Nintendo's handhelds, from the Game Boy to the Switch, have sold well enough that the bigwigs at Game Freak could probably go on a Caribbean pleasure cruise for the rest of their days, if they wanted to. The Pokémon franchise has sold so well, in fact, that it is now the next best-selling video game franchise of all time, second only to Mario, with over 360 million copies sold altogether. With their enormous contributions in popularizing JRPGs and kicking off the Pokémon craze, Red and Blue would easily have qualified for 5 stars. Yellow certainly played a part in that early ascendance, but with so few meaningful additions or innovations, ultimately not as big a part. So for me, a respectable 3 stars seems more appropriate. Whereas Game Freak were only at the start of their fruitful collaboration with Nintendo in 1998, the UK-based studio Rare were then at the height of their own long-standing partnership with a Japanese toy maker. Founded by brothers Tim and Chris Damper in 1985, Rare attracted the attention of Nintendo with their early efforts at decoding the Famicom, which Nintendo had boldly claimed was impossible for a third party to do. Impressed by the results, Nintendo decided to give Rare a contract which granted them a quote-unquote unlimited budget to make games for the Famicom. Grasping this rare opportunity with both hands, the Stampers and their team went straight to work and developed or ported over 50 titles for the Nintendo Entertainment System and Game Boy, including the infamously punishing Battletoads. On the Super Nintendo, their experiments with 3D pre-rendering led to Donkey Kong Country in 1994, one of the best-looking and best-selling games on the system. Its worldwide sales of 8 million copies, beaten only by 2 Mario titles on the Super Nintendo. This run of success impressed Nintendo yet again, and they decided to buy a 25% stake in Rare, which later grew to 49% and turned Rare into a second-party developer for Nintendo. Rare followed it up with a couple of Donkey Kong sequels before moving their efforts to the Nintendo 64, where they could finally try their hand at actual 3D games. There they made one of the first truly great console FPS games, GoldenEye 007, which became a bestseller on the Nintendo 64 and raised the bar for local split-screen multiplayer, using the console's 4-player functionality to great effect. A year later, they returned to platformers with a new original property, Banjo-Kazooie. After the huge success of Super Mario 64, which pretty much invented the rules for 3D platforming and camera control, Rare built on those foundations with Banjo-Kazooie and added some of their own trademark style. Featuring a pair of protagonists, Banjo the bear and his feathered friend Kazooie, who brings new meaning to the phrase backpacking, the game follows them as they try to save Banjo's sister from the clutches of the Wicked Witch Gruntilda. It certainly wasn't the first platformer featuring 2 or more protagonists. After all, the clue's in the title of Nintendo's iconic 1985 game, featuring the eponymous brothers Mario and Luigi. But the Super Mario Brothers started life just as palette-swapped versions of each other, with pretty much the same moveset, and there was nothing inherent in the game's design that even required the addition of a second character. Banjo-Kazooie, on the other hand, treated the partnership of its 2 main characters as a core element of its gameplay, as their equal billing in the title suggests. In fact, the pair are literally inseparable, as Kazooie spends most of his time fixed to Banjo's back, and occasionally the other way around. Banjo's bear-like brawn is complemented nicely by Kazooie's avian agility, giving players a vast array of movement options which would make little sense for either a single bear or a bird to possess. Among their many moves are Banjo's roll attack, Kazooie's egg shooting, beak stomping, and uphill sprinting, but more often than not, their abilities use a fluid combination of the duo's talents. Double jumping has Banjo's modest jump, aided by Kazooie flapping his wings for extra airtime. Swimming sees Banjo's legs and Kazooie's wings combining for a synchronized breaststroke, and their extra high backflip jump is a fluid piece of digital choreography that almost makes you believe a bird could haul an anthropomorphic bear 10 feet in the air. Overall, Banjo-Kazooie was simply a masterclass in animation. They may have benefited somewhat from the lessons taught by Super Mario 64, but Rare's game also did more than enough to distinguish itself from Nintendo's seminal platformer, and compared to many other 3D action and adventure games of the time, often stuck with stiff or clunky movement, Banjo-Kazooie clearly set a high bar. Another area where the game excelled was in audio design. Fittingly for a game whose main characters are named after musical instruments, Banjo-Kazooie placed great emphasis on music and its synergy with gameplay. Longtime Rare composer Grant Kirkhope, who wrote the music for such games as GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, and Viva Pinata, made the soundtrack and audio design of Banjo-Kazooie an important feature of the game. He used a varied collection of folksy and exotic instruments to build the score. Not only banjos and kazoos, but also marimbas, flutes, clarinets, tubas, shakers, and tambourines. Adding to that long list an assortment of jungle sounds, bird calls, and other odd noises that substituted for voice acting, Kirkhope created a fan-favorite soundtrack of many layers and different arrangements. The tunes would adapt and change not only based on the level you're in, but even where in that level you are, dynamically subtracting or adding instruments when the player goes underwater, for instance. Today, these sorts of dynamic soundtracks are fairly commonplace, but back in '98, Kirkhope's work was pretty innovative. But to be honest, I'm not really the guy to talk about music design, so here's Kirkhope himself explaining his methods. The way it worked in Banjo was that a programmer would place a sphere over the area that I wanted a certain combination of channels to play in, and I'd tell him which ones. He'd then turn it into a hexadecimal number and assign it to that sphere. It was time-consuming to write different versions of the theme and challenging, particularly in Banjo-Kazooie where I only had 16 channels to play with. In fact, as most levels had water, I would have to save one channel for the harp for the underwater effect. It worked pretty well overall. I loved the way it would seamlessly morph from one version to the other. I suppose that's the beauty of cartridges. All the information is available straight away, and no slow seek times like on DVDs. Following its release, Banjo-Kazooie was immediately heralded as one of the great platformers of its day, and received top marks all around, as indicated by its Metacritic score of 92%, which ranks it among the top 10 Nintendo 64 games of all time. At the second annual Interactive Achievement Awards, now known as the DICE Awards, it won Best Action Game on Console, a prize Rare had already bagged the previous year for GoldenEye. For Rare, it represented yet another hit in what must arguably be considered their golden age, coming just after GoldenEye and just before Perfect Dark, another beloved classic which often ranks among the best games on the console. Building on the first game's success, a few sequels would follow, starting with Banjo-Tooie in 2000, another hit for Rare on Nintendo 64, a platform where they could seemingly do no wrong. Soon afterwards, however, Rare's collaboration with Nintendo came to an end when they were bought out by Microsoft in 2002. Some Banjo titles have come out since, but none have reached the standards set by those first two, being relegated mostly to spin-offs and handheld games. Although it's hard to imagine a platformer in 1998 being a source of great innovation, as it was probably the most well-explored genre by that time, the double-team bond between Banjo and Kazooie may well have inspired others. In the years following its release, some of the most popular next-gen platformers, especially on Sony's PlayStation 2, seem to take inspiration from Banjo-Kazooie's idea of conjoined characters with complementary moves and abilities. Both Naughty Dog and Insomniac followed up their popular Crash Bandicoot and Spyro trilogies by creating a new platforming franchise headlined by such duos. Naughty Dog's Jak and Daxter came out early in the console's lifecycle, and much like Banjo-Kazooie featured a fairly laid-back protagonist, accompanied by his polar opposite, the motor-mouthed marsupial Daxter who echoes Kazooie's hyperactive attitude. The series would eventually give Jak a voice, turning him into an angsty gun-toting, goatee-sporting teen who hijacks hover cars in a fully open world akin to Grand Theft Auto 3, but the first entry had much in common with Rare's game. They both shared expansive levels that reward exploration, a bright, cheerful tone, and an emphasis on collectibles. Though of course, Jak can also be seen as a natural evolution of Naughty Dog's previous Crash Bandicoot games. Insomniac's Ratchet & Clank series, starting in 2002, likewise built on their previous Spyro trilogy, but stood out from other platformers with its planet-hopping sci-fi setting and its arsenal of imaginative weapons. Yet it also focuses on the companionship of its two main characters, the furry, short-swearing Ratchet and his robotic pal Clank, who clings to Ratchet like a backpack and gives him extra movement options to help reach inaccessible areas. Sound familiar? At this point, it's been more than a decade since the last Banjo game of any kind, but its legacy does live on in a project created by a number of ex-Rare employees, who drew on the help of Banjo fans through Kickstarter to fund a spiritual successor of sorts, Yooka-Laylee in 2017. Instead of a bird on a bear's back, Yooka-Laylee features the less alliterative combo of a bat on a chameleon's back, but otherwise the gameplay principles are pretty similar. It drew on the nostalgia that fans had for Rare's late 90s platformers such as Banjo, but unfortunately didn't do very much to evolve the gameplay. Its sequel came out in 2019 and scored higher with critics, but both games suffered slightly from being stuck in the past, appealing mainly to those who fondly remember the collectathon platformers of the era, and of course younger audiences, but not many others. And that's mainly where the impact of Banjo-Kazooie seems to lie, in the past. Its impact could be felt within the genre in the years after '98, with some of the most popular next-gen platformers following its example. It also affected the output of Rare in the same period, influencing the design of Donkey Kong 64 and some later games like Conker's Bad Fur Day. But otherwise it doesn't seem to have done too much to affect future games, and feels more like a relic from a particular era. Back when lives were still a thing, when magical sneakers could make you run insanely fast for 10 seconds before wearing out, and talking collectibles weren't supposed to make any kind of sense. Basically, Banjo was the epitome of the kind of zany 90s wackiness that was all the rage back then, whether in Saturday morning cartoons or 3D platformers. Because if there's one thing you can't fault Banjo-Kazooie for, that's a lack of personality. If anything, it sometimes had a little bit too much personality. It may not have been the most tasteful children's game ever made, but there's no denying its status as one of the great early 3D platformers, with an unusually large fan base behind it, considering how short-lived the series ultimately was. The hype around Banjo and Kazooie's inclusion in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate shows just how passionate that fan base can be, and their original game will no doubt remain a platforming icon for years to come, even if it wasn't hugely influential. Some games have a reputation of such stature that they hardly need an introduction. What's that? You want one anyway? Okay then. At the same time as their collaborators at Game Freak and Rare were working on blockbuster hits of their own, the wise old sages within Nintendo itself were preparing to unleash the latest entry in a legendary series. Meanwhile, Zelda fans the world over had built their expectations up to such heights that surely no game could live up to the hype. Or could it? But before we answer that question, let's first take a small trip down memory lane, or if you will, establish a link to the past. 12 years before, the venerated creator of Mario and most prominent face of Nintendo, Shigeru Miyamoto, released the first entry in a gaming legend. The anecdote he tells of the original ideas behind his 1986 game has since entered game development folklore. He wanted to make a game that captured the spirit of his youthful explorations, wandering the forests, hillsides, and caves near his childhood home in Sonobe, Japan. Miyamoto loved the sense of adventure and discovery he felt during his travels, illustrated best by his tale of coming upon a secluded woodland cave, which he cautiously entered armed only with a lantern, totally unaware of what he might find inside. Unlike most games, which present players with a clearly defined goal and usually some hints to guide them towards it, The Legend of Zelda simply set you loose in its world, gave you a sword to combat loneliness, and let you get on with it. East, west, north, or south, the world truly was your oyster, and you could explore it in pretty much any order you wanted, uncovering secret caves and dungeons along the way, often in very obscure locations. This first freeform adventure was a big hit from the start, and offered players a sense of adventure which they hadn't encountered in most games before. From there, Nintendo made the side-scrolling black sheep of the series, Zelda II: Adventures of Link, before making a more faithful sequel in 1991, A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo. It had much more of a narrative than previous games, with many towns, ruins, and other locales spread across its land of Hyrule, inhabited by characters of various races that could help you on your quest or sidetrack you from it. It also introduced a fundamental change to the game's structure, splitting Hyrule into light and dark worlds, with each region of the map having a corresponding dark side, presenting for the first time something which later became a recurring theme throughout the series, the introduction of a world-altering dynamic which reveals another side to Hyrule, or fundamentally changes it in some way. After Link to the Past, Nintendo made Link's Awakening for the Game Boy, another creative experiment for the series, which introduced some Mario elements, and then nothing was heard from the series for a long time. After 4 Zelda titles from 86 to 93, it took 5 whole years for the next one to arrive. In 1998, Ocarina of Time finally released, and confirmed the age-old proverb that good things come to those who wait. At this point, I could wax lyrical about the brilliance of the first 3D Zelda, how it redefined what adventure games could be, the brilliance of its interactive soundtrack, yada yada yada. But I'm sure there's 1,000 other videos or articles out there praising its virtues already, made by fans who know it even better than I do. So instead, let's begin by addressing the elephant in the room. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time was received pretty well, to put it very mildly. Released late in the year in Japan, in the last weeks of November, it still managed to sell 800,000 copies to reach the top 10 bestsellers of the year. In the US, it reached 500,000 pre-orders, 3 times more than any game before it, and eventually the Nintendo 64 version would sell 7.6 million copies, the 4th most of any game on the console. Although its sales figures are truly impressive, they don't come close to illustrating the wider acclaim the game has received. In terms of reviews, it remains pretty much in a league of its own, even today. It received the first ever 10 out of 10 from GameSpot, and also received full marks from Famitsu, Edge, IGN, GamePro, and Electronic Gaming Monthly, to name but a few. Although Metacritic only has 22 reviews to draw from, Ocarina of Time remains the king of its aggregated rankings, with 99%, the highest of any video game before or since. You know a game is good when its Metacritic score could only be improved by literally every critic giving it the highest possible score. Of course, one should keep in mind that it was reviewed over 20 years ago, when most aspects of it were on the cutting edge, or at least very impressive, from the visuals to the music and the fluid controls. It hasn't aged perfectly since, few games do, but even so it is still massively respected today. It probably goes without saying that it won a lot of Game of the Year awards in 1998, at the Interactive Achievement Awards to name just one, in what I think is probably the toughest year ever to claim the prize. But beyond that, it's also one of those rare games that inevitably gets a mention whenever the subject of greatest game of all time is discussed, with many arguing its case over all other competitors. The following is just a partial list of publications or gaming websites that have named Ocarina as the greatest game of all time, or ranked it first on a list of best games ever. Nintendo Power, Computer and Video Games Magazine, VG Charts, Game Informer, Joystick, Game Trailers, and IGN Reader Polls. And Next Generation Magazine, Edge, PALGN, Entertainment Weekly, and, FHM? Huh. That's without even mentioning the countless other lists where it landed in second place or elsewhere in the top 10. There are only a handful of games that are almost universally considered to be among the best of all time, but Ocarina of Time is definitely among them. So the game is good then. That much seems clear. But what about its influence? In many ways, Ocarina of Time was to Zelda and 3D action-adventure games what Super Mario 64 was to platformers. It was the first Zelda in 3D, representing a big leap from the last entries on the Game Boy and the SNES. The increased power of the Nintendo 64 and its 3D capabilities greatly expanded the scope of Ocarina compared to its predecessors, allowing the developers to express the gameplay and environments of Zelda in much greater detail and complexity than before, but equally challenging them to portray those elements in a 3D space where the game design rules hadn't yet been established. In that sense, their challenge was the same as with Super Mario 64, to lay down the groundwork for how 3D platformers should work, or in this case, 3D action-adventure games. Not that Ocarina was the first in that genre. After all, it came out 2 years into the console's lifecycle, and 3 years after the PlayStation debuted. But, as is often the way with Nintendo, their aim was not necessarily to invent new gameplay mechanics, though they enjoy doing that also, but to make theirs as polished, responsive, and easily understood as possible. One of the most important elements of reaching this aim was, much like in Mario 64, the design of the camera. At the time, most third-person games were either still relying on fixed camera angles, or had clunky cameras that had to be patiently aligned with enemies or the path forward. Ocarina instead had the camera following Link from behind, easily re-centered to his back with the touch of a button. It also had another solution to camera freedom, a first-person view where players could view the entire world around them freely, and aim certain weapons and gadgets with greater accuracy. It had the drawback of requiring Link to stand still while looking around, a quaint restriction by today's standards, but a common hybrid system at the time, as games tried to strike a balance between smooth camera work and showing off their newfound 3D glory. In combat, players could rely on the innovative C targeting system to keep the camera locked onto enemies. All you had to do was press or hold the C trigger to focus on your foe, enveloping them in a large, obvious targeting reticle and training the camera on them until you press the trigger again. It wasn't quite the first 3D game to introduce lock-on mechanics. Games like Tomb Raider had them earlier, but often lacked the clarity of Ocarina's system. They might lock onto targets automatically, taking the control out of players' hands, or leave the camera in awkward positions as it tries to strike a balance between keeping the target and your surroundings in view. Ocarina's targeting system was clearly an improvement over other games of the era, and before long, C-targeting, or some variation of it, had become the established method in most third-person games. Some of them would keep the clearly defined targeting reticles, while others tried more immersive solutions, but generally they followed the blueprint laid out by Ocarina. That includes using C-targeting as a modifier, meaning that some attacks or abilities are only available when you lock on and face enemies, like Link's jump attack or backflip. Action games like Devil May Cry have made it a central aspect of their combat, an efficient way to expand the attacking moveset of players, despite a limited amount of controller inputs. A more subtle aspect of C-targeting, and its impact on combat, was how it affected the enemy AI. When confronted by a group of enemies, locking onto your intended target not only focuses your attention on them, but theirs on you, and simultaneously sends a signal to surrounding enemies to back off or attack less frequently. The story behind this design choice was recounted by designer Yoshiaki Koizumi, who was inspired by a theatrical sword fight he and his colleagues witnessed at Toei Kyoto Studio Park. I thought there must be some kind of trick, so I watched very closely, and it was simple. It's a sword battle, so there's a script and a certain setup. The enemies don't all attack at once. First, one attacks while the others wait. When the first guy goes down, the next one steps in, and so on. Inspired by this staged fighting, they decided to morph it into a digital script for Ocarina's combat, using their C-targeting system to let the target know it should take center stage, while telling surrounding foes to, essentially, wait their turn. Anyone who has played the Batman Arkham series, any Assassin's Creed, or countless other modern action-adventure games has probably seen this kind of target prioritization working in the background. It can occasionally lead to some slightly weird-looking scenes when a dozen burly beefcakes shuffle menacingly around the player, while only one or two of them actually do anything. But hey, I'd be nervous too if I had to fight Batman. In general though, this sort of background choreography can bring greater fluidity and pacing to combat, without letting fights descend into total chaos, as 1 against 10 encounters probably would in real life. Or going so far towards power fantasy that you end up at Dynasty Warriors, a direction which of course Zelda would never take. Oh. Right. Never mind. Another innovative solution Nintendo had for streamlining Ocarina's controls was its context-sensitive A button. It definitely wasn't the first game to use context-sensitive controls. After all, it had long been a central feature in point-and-click adventure games on PC, where the mouse cursor would morph into icons for looking, touching, grabbing, and so on, depending on what you pointed at. But on console, it hadn't really been done before, and here again, Nintendo managed to simplify and improve, making traversal and interactions as streamlined as possible. The function of the A button would change depending on the context players found themselves in. Press A in front of a door to open it, press A to speak to people you're facing, hold A while swimming to dive underwater, pick up a bomb with A and press A again to throw it, stand in front of a heavy block and use A to push it, reach a ledge and A climbs it, find a chest, and you get the idea. Few games have made a single button as ubiquitous as Ocarina of Time did with its A button, but you can find similar contextual input in countless titles since then. Assassin's Creed had its idiot-proof Hold X to parkour system, which made climbing up rooftops and then running across them as easy as drinking water. And 2018's Cowboy Simulator Red Dead Redemption 2 has such a variety of realistically animated interactions that almost every button on the controller can be used in at least a few different ways, depending on the situation. And those are just two notable examples. If I were to list every console game after '98 that features some form of context-sensitive button, we'd be here all day. But while Ocarina's A button may have stood out from the rest with its wide range of uses, the rest of Ocarina's controls were also designed with this sense of readability and flexible functions in mind. As with the A button, all of the other face buttons were visible as on-screen icons at all times. The A button for contextual stuff, the B button to show Link's equipped weapon, and lastly 3 out of the 4 C buttons. The top C button was set aside for toggling first-person view and listening to Navi's endlessly helpful hints. But the other 3 were empty slots you could assign all kinds of equipment to. Basically, any usable item that wasn't a sword, shield, or a part of Link's wardrobe could be set to one of these 3 slots for quick and easy access. And since those buttons were always visible on a game's UI, you never had to memorize what they did at any given time. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to call this a revolutionary innovation or anything, as it's just an expanded version of something already done by past Zeldas, where you could assign various weapons and trinkets to the B button, but still, I think it's possible that it might have been an early inspiration for some of the many quick select features seen in games after '98. I mean, I'm no expert on the whole history of control schemes or UI design, so I might be way off the mark, but
It's just possible.
above and beyond its more specific game design innovations though, what really defined Ocarina of Time was simply its world. By translating the structure of Link to the Past into the visual language of 3D, Nintendo unwittingly designed a world that became an archetype for many open-world adventures after it. From the verdant greens of Hyrule Field to the imposing slopes of the volcanic Death Mountain, and the majestic waterfalls of Sora's Domain, Nintendo's latest iteration of Hyrule was undoubtedly their grandest yet. It presented a living fantasy world of many different biomes to explore, each occupied by their own distinct races. In a way, it was a form of wish fulfillment for fans of earlier Zeldas, and the Super Nintendo game in particular, taking many of its same areas and transforming them into larger and more detailed 3D environments. That's not to say that Ocarina's map was a carbon copy of Link to the Past, however. On the contrary, just like every Zelda before or since, Ocarina re-envisioned the world on its own terms, crafting a fresh new take on Hyrule without any direct ties to the setting or plot of previous games. Technically, this new 3D Hyrule wasn't quite open world, at least not in the seamless way that such games are today, but it came about as close to it as any game could on such limited hardware. It actually had more of an open hub space branching to separate area structure, as Hyrule Field was the only truly open area, situated at the world's center with paths leading from it in all directions to the forests, towns, and other areas surrounding it. But with very minimal load times between each zone, it managed to feel like a seamless world by, well, making those seams as unobtrusive as possible. The phrase, "look at it and you can go there," which today has become an unofficial tagline for massive open world games like Bethesda's Elder Scrolls, or many Rockstar games, really traces its origin back to Ocarina. Emerging onto Hyrule Field, you as Link could see the gates of Hyrule Castle and the ominous peak of Death Mountain as you drew ever closer, so that while they were technically gated by loading screens, the effect was more or less the same as traveling towards the settlement of Whiterun in Skyrim, for example. Polygon's Jeremy Parrish sums it up nicely in his 2018 article, all about the impact of visiting Hyrule Field for the first time. Open game worlds existed before Ocarina of Time, and in truth, Ocarina's rendition of Hyrule isn't really all that open, but the game explored the relationship between its environments, the camera's 3D perspective, and Link's place in it all to create a realm that felt far more like a real location than the game worlds that had come before it. Surreal platform playgrounds and grim shooter corridors were all well and good, but Ocarina gave you a seemingly massive kingdom to run around in, and it was Hyrule Field that sold the illusion. Even if Hyrule's seeming open-endedness was ultimately an illusion, it was nonetheless a potent, cleverly crafted one, which gave players a sense of what the future would hold in terms of holistic game worlds. And just when it seemed like they had seen everything that world had to offer, the wizards at Nintendo pulled the curtain back to reveal Hyrule from an entirely new perspective. A more adult perspective, that is. Similar to the world-changing shift midway through Link to the Past, which granted Link access to the altered dimension of Hyrule's Dark World and the ability to travel between both sides at will, Ocarina also granted passage between two versions of its Hyrule, or rather, two different time periods. After completing the first few dungeons of the game, where Link gathers the 3 sacred MacGuffins, he then receives the titular Ocarina of Time, and using these 4 key items together, gains entry to the innermost sanctum of the Temple of Time, leading to the next step in his fateful journey to find the 6 other sacred MacGuffins. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We must first enter the aforementioned room in the Temple of Time and collect that most sacred of MacGuffins, the Master Sword. Sorry. By pulling the Master Sword out of its pedestal, Excalibur style, Link gets transported 7 years into the future, emerging as an adult for the first time in both the game and in the mainline Zelda series as a whole. From then on, Link can travel freely between the two time periods, and between his child and adult selves, by placing the Master Sword back in the Temple of Time, and also gains use of the Ocarina's time-altering powers in certain situations. This temporal shift definitely felt like a big deal for the series, not to mention its impact as one of the more memorable moments in gaming history, even if it wasn't quite as innovative as Link to the Past's mirrored worlds. After all, this new, quote-unquote, world gimmick had many similarities to that of its predecessor, even down to the way Link's childhood Hyrule felt more carefree and light compared to the ominous darkness of Hyrule 7 years later. It also didn't affect gameplay to the same extent as that earlier concept, but in a narrative sense, this time skip actually felt more significant. Not only was Hyrule itself totally transformed under Ganondorf's rule during the 7-year gap, but so were the lives of its many citizens, and mostly for the worse. Their reactions to Link were also changed, after his transformation from naive child adventurer to the steely-eyed hero of time, reinforcing the greater sense of power and responsibility that adulthood brings with it. This transformation could even evoke a sense of guilt over the role you played in Ganondorf's rise to power, making players feel much more directly involved in the narrative than your typical Chosen One scenario ever could. Now, I've got to admit that at this point I was going to say a lot more about specific aspects of Ocarina's gameplay, and of course, mention its iconic dungeon designs. I was going to talk about how the transition to 3D changed the way weapons like bows or boomerangs could be used, moving from simple 4-way aiming to, well, every-way aiming, or how new items like the hover boots and mirror shield allowed players to do things that simply couldn't have been done in 2D. But at this rate, I'll spend at least twice as long on Ocarina as I have on any of the other games in this video. So in the interest of balance, I think I'll probably pick up the pace a bit. In any case, when it comes to the game's dungeons, there's nothing I can add that hasn't been said far better in the fantastic Boss Keys series by Game Maker's Toolkit. A comprehensive deep dive into the dungeons in every single Zelda game, as well as a few other games that might have been inspired by them. All I will add on the subject is to say that Nintendo's first attempts at 3D Zelda dungeons undoubtedly had some influence over level designers afterwards, as they crafted vast interconnected labyrinths of their own. But it's hard to know exactly to what extent, or to name any specific examples without interviewing those creators directly. Remember that ambient influence I mentioned in the intro? That's more or less how I think their impact worked. Ocarina's dungeons were more an example of the designers making something best in class and raising the bar for 3D level design, rather than doing something totally original. After all, there were some other influential 3D titles doing similar stuff around the same time, and many of the ideas seen in its temples had already been done in simpler form in previous games. One example of that is the Water Temple, whose core dynamic of raising and lowering water levels to access new areas had already been seen in its Link to the Past counterpart. Though naturally, the added depth in Ocarina's version, and Link's newfound ability to dive, meant it could be made much more elaborate and complex than before. For better or worse. I say worse because even the quote-unquote best game ever can have some flaws, and Ocarina's Water Temple is infamous for being the biggest notable dent in its nearly flawless reputation. Not only due to its convoluted puzzle solutions, which might require confused players to backtrack through the same spaces half a dozen times if they can't figure out the right way forward, but also for the major butt pain of having to equip or remove Link's iron boots every single time you need to sink or float. From the menu, that is, because who doesn't love pausing the game every half a minute when they're trying to solve some of its toughest puzzles? But you don't get to make a legendary gaming omelet without breaking a few eggs, as they say. The simple fact that Nintendo even tried to cram so many innovations and fresh mechanics into their first 3D Zelda is worthy of high praise in my view. The presence of a few failed experiments, among so many successful ones, did little to tarnish its stellar reputation, or its beloved status among both gamers and game developers alike. Speaking of which, you could probably spend a whole hour just talking about games and developers inspired by Ocarina of Time, or by Zelda more generally. But I don't quite have the time for that, so I'll make do with just a few examples, starting with one of my personal all-time favorite games. Shadow of the Colossus, directed by former artist turned game designer Fumito Ueda, seems to have a number of things in common with Ocarina of Time. The hero Wander shares a number of similarities with Link, as he gallops on his faithful steed Agro across wide open plains, with blade and bow at the ready, on a quest to save his own princess-like figure, by defeating the titular colossi that roam an ancient land. Mono, the maiden of his affections, is trapped in some mysterious unconscious state, perhaps a cursed sleep, or maybe an untimely death, and Wander's quest to reverse her fate also requires him to travel to every corner of the game world to fulfill a mythical prophecy. That vast world somewhat resembles Ocarina's Hyrule, despite its mostly barren desolation. At its center is a wide open field, where a massive structure towers over the landscape, and serves as an iconic landmark to help players navigate. From that central landmark, the desolate land stretches out in all directions akin to Hyrule Field, leading to diverse locales often hidden past narrow ravines or winding forest paths. In fact, its many abandoned ruins kind of give the impression that you might be wandering through an alternate, distant future version of Hyrule, many centuries or perhaps millennia after the collapse of its civilization. Even some of the Colossus designs seem inspired by Zelda bosses through the ages, and Wander's attempts at defeating them feel like a cross between conventional boss fights and solving a miniature Zelda dungeon. And like Link's Master Sword, Wander's blade is more than just a weapon, containing mystical powers pivotal to the hero prevailing in his quest. In Breath of the Wild, Nintendo seemingly chose to repay the homage, as its stamina wheel and climbing mechanics invoke those seen in Shadow, not to mention the divine beasts, skyscraper-sized walking dungeons which blur the line between mechanical creations and living beings, much like Ueda's 16 Colossi. Now I have to be totally honest and admit that these links I've drawn between Zelda and Shadow are mostly drawn from my own observations, and I can't really claim that Ueda himself would agree with them. When I wrote this a while back, I was sure that I read an article or interview somewhere in which he referenced Zelda, but since then I can't seem to find it anywhere. So yeah, feel free to take it with a big pinch of salt. But while I might have just imagined Ocarina's influence on Ueda's game, it's easy enough to find other game creators who openly state the impact it has had on their own work. Speaking to GameSpot, Darksiders lead designers Joe Madureira and David Adams both speak about their love of Zelda and how it shaped the creation of their own franchise. It made sense, creating that 3D world with puzzles and new items and having the right amount of difficulty and progression, the feeling of mastering everything you've learned in order to progress. Zelda nailed that 30 years ago, and it still carries the torch for other games. It influenced our understanding of what games could be. Many of us are still emulating that. In fact, they were so enamored with Ocarina that they referenced it in their temporary working title for Darksiders, which they referred to in-house as Ocarina of Time or Death. And just in case there was any lingering doubt, David Adams adds, "We wanted to combine that sort of exploration and platforminess of games like Ratchet & Clank or Zelda with the more serious combat of a game like Devil May Cry." Speaking of Devil May Cry, its creator Hideki Kamiya, who you may recall as a director of another game on this list, also drew on his admiration for Zelda to create one of his own games, the visually stunning adventure game Okami. At first glance, it may not seem that similar to Nintendo's Legend, with its Japanese watercolor aesthetic and divine canine protagonist making it stand out from other games even today. But look past the artistic surface and the similarities soon become apparent. Both feature silent main characters who awake from a kind of slumber, enter a giant magical tree, and embark on an epic quest to save their land from evil, accompanied by tiny tutorial fairies who can't stop explaining things to them all the time.
Not listening. Not listening.
They also both use magical instruments that allow them to change the world in a very literal sense. Link with his ocarina, and Amaterasu with her celestial brush. In the latter case, this brush also stands in for many of the gadgets and abilities found throughout Zelda games. But here instead they are simply drawn into being by way of Ami's godlike powers. As with Darksiders, Okami wears its inspiration very much on its sleeve. Though it should be noted that Okami still has plenty of fresh ideas to stand on its own as a unique experience, even beyond its art style and celestial brush mechanics. Last but not least, Hidetaka Miyazaki, father of the so-called Soulsborne subgenre, which contains the original Demon Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne and others, has also spoken of Zelda with reverence. But like the stories in his games, Miyazaki's answer is more vague and mysterious when asked about Zelda's ties to his own games. When I was a student, Legend of Zelda was truly monumental, so to be perfectly honest, I feel deeply unworthy of the comparison. Legend of Zelda and Dark Souls are different games belonging to different genres though, and they're guided by different concepts of game design. They don't need to aspire to the same ideals. If there are similarities, they probably stem from the fact that Zelda became a sort of textbook for 3D action games. By that last sentence, I'm assuming he means Ocarina, since, well, it was the first 3D Zelda. But either way, it's not hard to see how Ocarina, and Zelda more generally, might have influenced its designs for Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and the other games of that lineage. Not only do they superficially resemble each other in gameplay terms, with Souls games using a modern form of Z-targeting, and generally feeling like an extremely punishing version of Zelda combat, but their world structure, especially in Dark Souls 1, feel like an expanded evolution of Zelda's dungeon designs on a grand scale, with the entire game worlds linking up in elaborate and often surprising ways, similar to 3D Zelda temples, and for that matter, some of the regions in Ocarina's Hyrule. Likewise, the sense of discovery, which lies so near the core of every Zelda experience, is taken even further in games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Says Miyazaki, "Our goal was to allow players to do what they want, define their own goals, make their own discoveries, embrace their own values, and find their own interpretations. Core to that was the importance of getting lost. This gives value and meaning to finding one's way." And I don't know about you, but I can just as easily imagine that quote coming from Shigeru Miyamoto instead of Miyazaki. Not that I want to put words in his mouth, but it seems to apply almost perfectly to his first freeform adventure way back in 1986, or even to the massive open world of Breath of the Wild, which can take 200 hours to beat for those who enjoy getting lost, or just half an hour for speedrunners who have mastered its every secret. So, there you go. Those are just a few of the high-profile games inspired by Ocarina. But like I said before, I could go on for an hour or more if I mentioned every game it influenced. And if you expand that to games influenced by the entire Zelda series, we really could be here all day. And I've hardly even touched on the perspective of fans, partly because it's hard to sum up in a few sentences how millions of people feel about anything, but also because, well, if you know about Zelda at all, you probably already know how widely beloved it is. As you'll see in a few minutes, user ratings for Ocarina line up pretty closely with those of critics, meaning it often sits very near the top of the pack on websites which have those sort of user rankings. Some fans have even shown their love for Ocarina through one of the highest forms of flattery I think any game can receive, by just making more of it, whether legally or otherwise. Using the game's engine, a few dedicated modders have created homebrew expansions of their own, such as Dawn and Dusk, or the quote-unquote Ocarina of Time randomizer mod, which does exactly what you'd expect, randomly placing quest items and other elements in new locations to create a fresh experience within a familiar setting. Other dedicated fans have taken almost the exact opposite approach. Instead of using the old engine to create new content, they've tried to faithfully recreate the original game using new engines. Not only one, not two, but at least 3 creators have used Unreal Engine 4 to remake portions of Ocarina in glorious, shiny HD. Some focusing on creating specific scenes in great detail, and others opting for a more expansive approach in projects that have clearly cost years of hard work in some cases. One nostalgic fan has even tried to recreate Ocarina in the style of Link to the Past, a sort of 3D to 2D demake, if you will. So yeah, whether you view it through the lens of critical reception, influential game design, or fan admiration, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time stands monumental. If my influence scores went up to 6 stars, it might well rank among the very few games deserving of such a score. But I'm afraid 5 stars is all I've got, so it'll have to do for the 5th Zelda, one of the most influential games of all time.